glad to have everyone here. Hope you guys had a good lunch. We definitely did. So my name is Vlad Micu. It's my pleasure to sit here with an old and an incredibly good friend of mine, Maarten de Koning. Since this fire chat is pretty much talking with you, Maarten, I'd love to ask you to, of course, begin with introducing yourself before I do.
Yeah, so I'm Maarten. I've been a video game agent for the past 10 years. Before that, I was doing investments. And one of the partners at Digital Development Management, DDM, which is basically one of the bigger agencies in the industry that represents top game developers and publishers in the industry. We work with From Software, Platinum Games, Mercury Steam, Jaeger, and obviously a lot of smaller developers that are like really upcoming. And what we basically do, we provide business development services, corporate strategy, and basically enable developers what they do best, which is obviously developing games. So that's me.
And what did you do before you joined DDM? Like, what's kind of like your background in terms of development?
Yeah, so before my company was acquired by DDM, I owned a company called Greenhill, which was a production house. So what we did was we brokered deals for a developer, but we also stayed involved with production. So we were basically doing the executive production of the titles. And before that, like I said, I was doing investments. So I worked for a investment company that was investing in a lot of startups, and obviously game companies as well. And that's basically how I got into games in 2006.
And how we met.
And how we met.
Exactly.
Yep.
So my name is Vlad Micu. I have been in the business for 12 years now. Started as a journalist, worked my way up into development, and at one point realized that I'll leave the game development to people who are much better at it than me, and I'll try to help that talent with the business side of things. So of course, Maarten and I, we have quite often catch-ups and talk about these things, because what Maarten, of course, does with DDM, I try to do on a smaller scale, as one person with the small to mid-sized game developers that I work with, right? So what I usually say is, I try to save the developers I work with time, I try to save them money, and they technically pay me to tell them what they don't want to hear. And aside from that, I'm also a free agent, so I help out a lot of indie developers in my free time. I have a very simple rule, which I think Maarten can agree with, and that's if we see that you do something really cool that we believe in, we will be your biggest champions. Very simple, right? So just to kind of have an idea of who we have in the audience. Of course, we have a big room, but we have a group of people that are here for a very specific topic. So. Maarten, what would you like to know about the audience? Do you have any specific questions?
Well, I would like to know. I mean, how many game developers do we have in this audience here? That's quite a few.
How many aspiring game developers do we have here? So students that want to become a game developer? Okay.
Only a few. Okay.
Okay.
So how many of you guys here in the audience, how many of you have done publishing deals yourself? Only a few. Okay.
Okay, who wants to do one, or who's looking for money at the moment to fund their game? Who's thinking about it? Okay, okay. So we have a lot of people who are curious about the topic, but don't have an immediate need.
But not necessarily know whether they want to work with a investor or publisher. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, the good news that we have for you guys is that never have we ever been in a position where we had so many different options to get the right funding and get the right partners, or very specific deals that cater not so much to everything, but only the things we need, right? So, Maarten, when we're talking about gathering funding, what would you say are the most important basic materials that a developer should just have in line to just get going out there and start talking to people?
Well, I think the first question you need to ask yourself, like, what do you want from an external partner? Be it funding, be it distribution, be it whatever, right? I think that's the first question that every single developer should ask themselves, like, what do I want from this? If you made up your mind that you want to work with a publisher or an investor or a strategic fund, then you need to decide, okay, what do I want from this partner? I will say in general, the rule of thumb when approaching investors or publishers or whoever, you need to have, I think, a playable. First and foremost, I mean, we're in this industry because it's entertainment. We all love games, we're very passionate about games. And the thing is, like, it's all about the fun in a prototype or in a playable. And so you need to have a prototype at least. And it's totally fine to have a gray box prototype, right? As long as you're able to showcase the core mechanic of the game. Besides that, I would highly recommend having a game deck that basically provides the elevator pitch of what the game is, what the key pillars of the game are, what the unique game features are, how much content there is, and very important, obviously, what's the business model? Are you going for a premium game? Are you going for free to play? I mean, all those things. And then, obviously, what's the whole value proposition? What are you offering to an investor or a publisher? What do you expect in return? What do you want from this partner? And I think outlining that in a deck is needed. And very important, besides the playable or the prototype, you need to have a video, a gameplay video. Because obviously at a show like this, when you're standing at the bar and having these nice large beers, you obviously want to be able to pull up your phone and show a gameplay video of your game. Very important. Maybe like a lot of people think it's a very simple thing, but you need to have it on your phone or your iPad or whatever. Always have it with you, because you never know when you're standing somewhere and meeting an interesting
exactly,
person.
and this just goes for anyone out there, right? If whether you're an artist or an indie game developer, I've had so many people show something to me while waiting in line and stuff like that, which kind of, I guess, you know, that point kind of ties into the point of course, the different deal types that are out there, right? We've got Kickstarter going on still, initiatives like Fig coming up, which are a very interesting hybrid. That kind of developed out of that. People using Patreon to fund their games, which is, for me, always an exciting thing, because it gives you that direct contact with the community.
Yep.
And, you know, you can kind of strengthen your negotiating position, I would say, if you want to go for a bigger distribution deal with the publisher. And, of course, investors, right? So is anyone here actually kind of going down that startup route of actually trying to seek angel investment, you know, potentially going for Series A? Anybody? So that's kind of interesting, right? That's not a thing here, because just to give you a bit of reference, I was just in Finland 24 hours ago going to Slush, which is an event Maarten and I often go to, because that's where pretty much it's the biggest event for startups in Europe to go and pitch to investors. So the only thing you do there is you go, you book your meetings, and you just sit down for 3 days or 2 days in a row, 3 days, and have meetings with investors. And, you know, now there's also funds out there, right? So there's specific funds for game developers, for game companies to get investment from. So we've got all these different types of sources of money, but we also have different deal types. Can you share something about some recent deal types that you, for example, have worked with?
I mean, I think the most traditional deal type is obviously going to a publisher that knows games, is publishing games, and asking them for funding to build and finalize your game. That's by far the most traditional model. I will say it's a little bit of an outdated model as well, because getting publisher money is very expensive money. Why? Because in general, and I totally understand why, a publisher is quite risk averse. From the 10 titles that they sign, 8 fail, 9 is doing the 9th title is doing break even, and 1 is doing exceedingly well, right? So it's almost like Russian roulette in a way. But the thing is, like in the past, people were going to a publisher with a paper concept and saying, "Hey, this is my game. I want to get it funded." I think nowadays a much better strategy is to go to the publisher and say, well, actually I have a very, maybe like an alpha of this game. I invested a lot of money in this, and I want to engage you for these services. It can be marketing, it can be distribution, community management, whatever, user acquisition. So I think what we nowadays see is that even though we still have the traditional publishing deal, I think developers have a much better position because they're more invested. That's also, I think, because certain developers are able to bootstrap themselves and basically work together for a long time on a game. But as you mentioned, there's also crowdfunding. There are various ways to get funded,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, we have a talk about, I think, European funding coming up in the program, I think either later this afternoon or tomorrow, which is a great example, right? You manage to, you of course have to have the skills of writing a convincing grant application, and then if you're lucky, you get some money, right? So, so that's also a great example. So, could you mention, like, is there like a recent type of deal that caught your attention that is happening more often in your line of business? And how, could you give some details about the deal structures that you've dealt with recently?
Yep. So, I mean, to talk more about that co-funding deal, so what I really like, if a developer has put in significant funding, we basically have leverage to really negotiate a good deal with a publisher. And then we can basically say, well, listen, it's totally fine that, like, let's say you invested 1 million or 500,000 euros yourself. Then we can say to the publisher, if you match that funding, it's fine if you recoup first, but we want to have these services like marketing. And I know marketing is always a very sensitive topic. Because normally publishers are doing marketing, and for a developer it's very difficult to see and to feel like, are they doing the right marketing? Are they really spending the dollars where they are saying they're doing it? And
how are they quantifying it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what is marketing?
And normally it's kind of a black box marketing, right? And it's a lot of money which is normally deducted from your revenue share. So what I like with that co-funding deal is that you can basically say, well, publisher, we invested to this level, you're going to invest as well. However, PR, marketing, everything you need to do to get the game out is on your dime. Meaning that they need to handle that and it's non-recoupable. And that's something I really like with a co-funding deal, and something I see more and more, is that a developer actually is almost using the publisher in a way that they say, well, we have a Chinese menu here and I want these options. And in the end, I think that benefits everyone, because the publisher knows what's to focus on. The publisher is not giving away their very expensive money, but instead are investing in a game they believe in, because guess what? You also invested in a game, right? So together, I think you add a lot of value, and there's a much better balance. I mean, I think it's the start of a really good relationship, and that's something I think we also should talk about.
So I didn't print any sheets for you guys here in the audience, but secretly in my head I'm kind of playing publishing fundraising bingo, and I was waiting for Maarten to mention the Chinese menu word, because that's like one of the things that we're using quite often in conversations nowadays, right? So to give you an example of a deal that I've been dealing with quite often, like Maarten mentioned, which is quite traditional, is where a developer sets up an investment fund specifically to fund new games or existing games that get adapted or improved that didn't do so well initially. Actually, that happens quite often, right? Games get a second wind by being reskinned, reapplied, and maybe even launched on a different platform. So what you get is you get a certain amount of money. Let's say your budget is $250,000, and what the publisher in this case does is, of course, they go through rigorous scrutiny. So they check your pitches, they look through your documents, they look through your budget, through your planning. Quite a lot of Excel, I would say, comes into play, right? The profit and loss, all of those beautiful things. And then eventually, if you get to that point, like we were discussing at lunch, you'll get to the signing situation. You're going to negotiate different clauses and whatnot. If you're smart, of course, you'll realize that a lot of those clauses are there to test you, and you shouldn't accept them. And then at one point, you get the money, you start working, but there's a recoup, right? So the publisher in this case that I've been involved in wants to recoup that money first, so you will have to earn it back through the revenue, and then you have your full revenue share. So in this case, imagine it's 50-50 on paper, but you only get 30% after you launch until the publisher earned back the initial $250,000. And then you go back to even 50-50, which, you know, makes sense.
Makes sense. Okay.
Right? It depends on what kind of game it is, and you know, is it free to play? Is it a PC game? How are you looking at that situation right now? Because I think from my perspective, at least, and from the perspective of the audience, there's not a lot of free to play people in the audience, are there? Any free to play? One person. Okay, thank you so much for representing. I appreciate that.
More than we thought.
Yeah,
initially.
but so you know, for example, in Finland, mostly free-to-play game companies, they do the whole startup routine. They go for equity funding. They try to not have to give revenue share. What are your thoughts on you know, the free-to-play premium situation right now in terms of deal making?
Well, the thing is with free-to-play, normally when developers are looking for funding in free-to-play, it's like obviously mobile first. And finding funding for mobile is almost impossible if you're looking for project funding. So only funding for the actual project and not equity funding, right? So in general, deals that we have been doing in the mobile space is very much with Asian publishers, Chinese publishers, that normally require an equity investment in your company. What it also means when you're looking for a deal as a free-to-play company, you normally need to invest quite a bit until you're able to soft launch. Because obviously you need to have KPIs to show to the publisher like, hey, listen, these are the metrics we believe we're going here, this is where we stand, but this is our goal. And then basically using that Asian publisher and their user base to really scale the game, right? So normally it's almost like a distribution deal in a way whereby the publisher is also investing in your company, because in general, be it like King.com, be it Nexon or Tencent, they all want to do equity investment.
Yeah.
That's very important. What we do see is that a lot of developers that were dabbling in mobile free-to-play are now, since 1.5 and 2 years, are moving over to PC free-to-play and console free-to-play. And that, to me, I think that's going to be a growth market for sure.
Yeah. And I think a great example of what recently happened in that field is that Pearl Abyss, a Korean company known for Black Desert Online, recently acquired CCP from Iceland, the guys who were making EVE Online, right? So there's also, of course, and we're not going to go into that topic because that's a whole different ballgame, but there's acquisitions happening. THQ recently acquired, I believe, Coffee Stain, which originally was an indie developer that then became a publisher.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, and that's another trend that I think you see, and obviously those companies are here. If you look at 11-bit, for example, Mad Finger Games, those are companies that all started as a developer and now are doing publishing. And the cool thing I feel with these type of companies is that they have that developer DNA, and that I think is really important. For Coffee Stain, obviously, with Goat Simulator, I've been working with them on a few things, and the cool thing with Coffee Stain is that you can pitch a game to them, but they basically say, well, thanks for the pitch, but they first want to hang out. They first want to have drinks with you or dinner or whatever. And then for the coming months, they want to spend time with you to get to know you. And if they then feel like, hey, we can actually become friends, then they want to sign your deal, which I think is a really interesting trend, because if you look at the old model, you had publishers. You pitch to a publisher, the first thing they do, they send a team to your studio to look at the studio, see if the people are actually in the office. they ask about your game, and it's all very corporate, very dusty. It's a long process. And then you start working together. But to me personally, what I really like is when you start off with a personal relationship, you're in a much better position to create something unique, because then everyone understands the vision, everyone appreciates each other, and that's a whole different business relationship than when you have that real corporate approach. And that's what I really like of companies, as I just mentioned, including Coffee Stain. Yeah,
who recently got acquired by THQ, so now they get to do that for THQ.
Exactly.
THQ Nordic, I should say.
THQ Nordic.
My apologies. Sorry, THQ. Nordic. So just to pull all of this back to the local scene. Now, I'm a big fan of the Czech developer scene here. It's why I've been coming here. I try to come every year to catch up with you guys. And so most recently, of course, we've actually had some examples of what we just talked about. So I feel the guys from Warhorse had a pretty strong negotiating position with Koch Media when they signed the distribution deal for Kingdom Come Deliverance. And I strongly, it's out there, right? They've built up such a strong base community that you almost kind of start wondering, okay, who actually won more in this situation? Was it Koch or was it Warhorse? Of course, you hope that it's a symbiotic relationship that comes out of that, where the strengths get complemented based on the Chinese menu situation that we talked about, and and I'm going to do another inside bingo, that there's a hockey stick coming out of the launch that goes nice and up in terms of sales, and that keeps going up forward, right? You mentioned Madfinger. Mad props to them because they're another example of developers that pretty much started up from the ground. Same thing with Bohemia, the guys from Keen Software House. I've actually bumped into a few other indie developers around here. Of course, we've got Jakub Dvorsky from Amanita, who I know is helping out local developers, but he's doing it on his own way, right?
Exactly.
Which kind of brings us back to the whole boutique publishing rise right now, where there's actually people, sometimes one or two people, that help indies as a boutique publisher. So how have you kind of looked at the rise of these smaller sized publishers that really try to complement what developers already have?
Well, I think a great reference is Raw Fury in Stockholm, Sweden.
Do you guys know Raw Fury? Kingdom, awesome game. One example.
Yeah.
They have a whole
so
portfolio.
I think what really defines Raw Fury is that yes, you have Devolver Digital, and I have a lot of respect for Devolver Digital, but they were one of the few companies that were doing this guerrilla marketing and very focused on indie, pixelated games. And but what I really like with Raw Fury, like similar to Coffee Stain, it's all about the relationship. It's all about like, hey, can we become friends? And they're all, and this is also important, they're all really gamers. They love games, games is their life. And what you sometimes unfortunately see, and especially with Asian companies or like big companies like Tencent, you sometimes see that a lot of people that work for these companies are not necessarily gamers. They're just working for an internet company, right? And to me, that sometimes means that it's just more difficult to do a deal because those people normally have a harder time to really understand your game. What I like with these boutique developers, and again, I'm comparing apples to pears in a way, because Tencent, again, they want to invest and it's free to play and it's games as a service bigger, and now we're talking about Raw Fury, which is obviously indie games, premium, single player, mainly. But again, what I really like is their approach. It's very down to earth. They have a flat organization, so even though Jonas, the owner of Raw Fury, is the big guy there, he is very similar as the rest of the company. And again, that opens doors. That, I think, is a great way for developers to get in there, talk about their game. And they also do great ways of marketing. So for example, at GDC last year, they had an Airbnb, which is like a big loft.
Big loft.
And in that loft, they had multiple sections, like in the living room, where their developers were basically in the living room showcasing their games with beers and food. And it was basically almost where basically what we do in the Netherlands, we come together and we play games together and we barbecue and whatnot. That feeling. And it's just a great way to market your game. So,
yep. And so that kind of puts us in one last specific topic I wanted to address before we go into questions. I hope there are questions, otherwise we can just keep on rambling about this stuff for forever. But coming back to the funding side, one of the recent developments that you and I were also just catching up on is, of course, the different kind of deal structures in the terms that there's now funds that go equity, revenue share, but the project-based funds, those are interesting to me because technically you kind of sacrifice the potential, like for example, your IP in this case, or you don't really you don't give up equity but revenue share in those deals, but it's a viable opportunity if the project is right. So what are your thoughts on that development?
on the funds, you mean?
Yeah, on the different funds that are popping up with the different types of offers.
Yeah, I would say I think 2018 as a year, I think we can classify as probably the year where the games industry is all about like investment. A lot of independent developers are getting acquired. I'm not saying that's a good thing, because I do like to see that there are a lot of independent developers, and luckily there are a lot of new indie developers that eventually in 5 or 10 years are becoming those bigger developers again. But what we see, and that's a really interesting development, there are various funds, as Vlad mentioned, that are basically strategic funds, meaning that they don't want equity, no, they just want to stimulate and support creative initiatives, games, mainly games. And one of those funds is Kowloon Knights Fund in Hong Kong. It's backed by NetEase, it's backed by Colopola, which is a Japanese big company. And for example, what they do, I mean, they work with Gen Design in Japan, and they basically are funding their prototype.
Now, are you working with Gen Design in this case?
No.
Okay,
Gen Design is represented by UTA and a Hollywood agency. Ophir is their agent. But Gen Design, but what I do know is that their prototype is being funded by the fund. And then once that prototype is ready, they basically go out to a publisher and then secure the rest of the funding. But what I really like here is that the fund is just enabling the developer to create something really unique, really compelling, really creative, and then go to a publisher once they have that first playable, almost vertical slice that they can pitch. And you see more and more of these funds that are at least give you guys the wings to develop something. And then
early stage, right? Like hyper early stage.
Of
Like
course.
you might not even have a company early stage, and they'll believe in the team, like a Coffee Stain does, and invest in that. Right?
Exactly. And the cool thing then, and then we go full circle back to like, oh, we can still engage the publisher to do all those services, and again, it puts you in a really good position. And the business model for these funds is mainly to get revenue from day one. And they normally want to have like a first right on sequels and prequels. So if you would do a next game, they want to be involved as well. But let's be frank, is that a bad thing? I mean, if your game is doing well and they want to put funding again in your next game, I don't think that's a bad thing.
If you like them, if they like you.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a very interesting point that I did want to add, where there's this fund that is backed by these big Chinese companies. So instead of going straight to these Chinese companies, you get to work with the fund. And there's a two-sided story to that, because you get the benefit of getting an investment into your project or your company that isn't a strategic investment. Meaning, if a company invests in you, like Tencent, you can't go to Tencent's competitor anymore to raise money. You're technically locked down to whoever, you know, if they have a conflict of interest, right? So it's smart for them to set up these kind of independent funds, and it's good for you because you can still go out and look for money without a conflict of interest, right? So last point, the stage of development. We were talking about it a little bit. So one of the recent things I've noticed is that it's never been as flexible to get a publisher, even when games are already out. What have you seen happening on that side, where developers are almost finished and then just at the point of almost being able to press launch on Steam decides to work with the publisher instead, or even are out there already and then go back?
I mean, in general, if your game is already out, and I'm talking about like a premium game on Steam or GOG, if that game is out, then in general, publisher's not gonna bother anymore, because the game is out, there's an audience already, people are playing the game is being reviewed. There's not much that the developer can then do. If, for example, if the game is not received well, they cannot do damage control. So if your game is almost finished and you want to talk to a publisher, you need to postpone the release, obviously. That's one.
Sure.
Secondly, publishers are not a fan of doing a staggered release, meaning PC first and then 3 months later Xbox and then 3 months later PlayStation. No, it needs to be one sim ship across all platforms, because again, they want to do their marketing efforts and then push out on all platforms and have maximum impact, which is logical.
And if there's one lesson I learned with my clients in the last couple of years, is you do only have one launch.
One launch.
And if you're privileged enough to have a game that you can only launch on PC, but then it gets successful, of course, then suddenly you have the opportunity of potentially branching out, importing your title to different other consoles. But that's, of course, not a given. Like, we're talking about risk management in the end. Everything that we are discussing right now is about risk management. If you're a sure case deal, everyone is going to want to throw money to you. If you're not, you're going to have to convince us and the people we work with, right? So I think...
Well, I want to add a little bit on that.
Do.
So obviously we were just talking about premium games, right? I mean, I will say, if you're developing a game for, let's say, mobile or PC, and it doesn't necessarily have to be free to play, but let's say games as a service, then I still feel that early access can be beneficial.
Well, that's soft launching, right?
Soft launching,
or beta
in a way.
Google,
but again, you need to be very careful when you soft launch, how much content you're going to provide. Because the last thing you want is that people see it more as a prototype, or the last thing you want is that people see your game, which is in early access and not finished yet, as a finished game. And I have seen examples in the past where games were being bashed because, yeah, like, hey, this is not a finished game, because the developers were actually doing a great job in providing great production values already, and they were like, yeah, but where's the content, right? But I'm just saying that with games as a service, you can benefit from an early access phase. Sure. I will say that publishers are normally not a fan of early access because, again, they cannot like have leverage, or they cannot control it, because then it's out in the hands of people, right? There have been very few examples where a publisher was able to leverage their skills to make a game successful, which was in early access. There are few, but not many.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about Diablo Immortal, so don't ask questions about that stuff. It's not going to happen. So,
but, yeah.
Questions, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe for the audience, and what I sensed, and when we were chatting for the past 35 minutes, not a lot of people apparently in this audience are keen to deal with a publisher or basically work with an investor. But how many people here are interested in maybe talking about numbers? Like, what does it mean to do a distribution deal, for example? Or what does it mean to do a whatever, like a mobile deal? I mean, do people here want to hear numbers, or is it something we need to elaborate on? Or, I mean,
we have some numbers over there. We have some numbers over there. We have some numbers over there. So let's open up the audience for questions. If you have any other questions than numbers, of course we're happy to cater to those as well. But we're happy to answer those questions. So go for it. Help yourself. No. So you want to know numbers, but you don't have any specific question. Okay.
Okay.
Here we go. That gentleman wants to.
Yeah, we're gonna chat a little bit about numbers once we.
Hi. I definitely want to hear the numbers too, but so I was interested in you were talking about the angel investments before, and if you can speak a little bit more about that, because if I'm looking for 5 to 20K only, if you have any examples of developers that have found this small investments kind of like an uncle handout in a way.
20,000 euros?
Yeah.
Okay, so not Czech kroners, because I can pull that out of my pocket right now.
I mean, I would say like that's a very small investment. If you're looking for so little money, I would highly recommend either raising it from family, or like local investors, or
friends and fools. Bingo. So friends, family, fools, right? That's the
no, but
the term.
that's I think that's a seed investment, and that should come, I think, from friendlies. Because normally an investor would not bother with that amount. I think in general, in Europe at least, I'm not talking about the US, because the US is a whole different ballgame and much bigger in terms of investments, but I think in Europe, they normally wouldn't bother if it's below 500,000. Maybe 300 or 400,000, but in general, I would say sub 500,000 is not interesting for investors.
Yeah. So the good news from my end, right, is that we're not talking about a lot of money here. Of course, first of all, you have to ask yourself, as we discussed, what are you willing to give for that money? Because like I said, there are people who like to come in early, take a risk. They'll most likely want to meet you, get to know you, see your project, and so forth, which is a process, right? Making money costs money, so it's going to cost you time to talk to these people. But keep it close, right? So to give you a great example, since we're also, using this opportunity to mention some names that we find of initiatives and investors and publishers that we feel you should at least look into if you're looking into raising funds. A great example from Finland is Sisu Ventures. They do hyper early investments of 50,000 euros, right? They take equity, but then they also help you find additional funding because their fund is by developers for developers. So you have a massive pool of very influential people who invested in that fund. I sadly didn't because I just bought a home. Otherwise, I would be one of them. And so the amount is low, but the impact, the support that you get from that network of people who've invested in that fund is huge, right? It might be bigger than going to Uncle Bob, who has a few hotels and can give you 20,000 and might have completely different terms, right? He might just loan it to you, right? But like we were talking about, like sometimes these deals can just be very expensive loans. So it really comes down to, that's not a big amount. You live in a country where I think 20,000 euros can get you pretty far, which is a great negotiating point. And then the question is, start talking to people. right? And the question between stupid money and smart money. Do you just want it from Uncle Bob, or do you want it from one of us who is in the business, who might help you with platform relations, with publisher relations, whatnot?
Yep.
But that's not generally something that Maarten does, and not something I generally do. But
no, but you also
it's
have
an option.
Yeah, and you also have incubator programs, right?
Exactly.
So I think there's gonna, later, like in an hour or something, there's gonna be a talk about incubator programs in the Netherlands. There's a gentleman in the back who's preparing his, finalizing his presentation. He's gonna give a talk about like what that means, like an incubator program, working with smaller developers. And it almost seems that you could really benefit from an incubator program.
Exactly.
Now, I don't know personally how things are progressing here in terms of incubator programs, but it's definitely something that in Western Europe you see a lot, right? So, as you say, in Finland, in the Netherlands, in Germany, you have a lot of incubator programs. And that, I think, for a lot of maybe studios here that are smaller, could be a great first step in getting some financial support, but more importantly, having the right mentors, having the right people around you that can make introductions. And once you then are on that level, you can see, okay, do we want equity investment? Do we want publisher funding? And then basically you get a snowball effect, right? So that's normally the trajectory that you see with like a smaller developer becoming a bigger developer.
And I'm not sure if some of you guys were here last year. I had the pleasure of actually doing a panel with some of my peers who were helping out initiatives in Poland and different other Central European countries. And so when you're raising 20,000 euros, the question is also not so much about getting that money, but how can you save in other parts so you don't need that money in the first place. And a great example that I gave was Stugan, which we both know, which is an initiative in Sweden, where if you're a 1 or 2 man team, you can apply. It's funded by Swedish developers for an international indie group. You sign up, you apply. If you get selected, you get to stay in a cottage in the Swedish forest for 2 months. But I did my calculations when I was in the first edition, and we saved 5,000 euros per person on food, accommodation, and everything. Of course, we had to pay our own transportation, but that was also kind of like, well, you got to do something, right? But imagine, we were there with 3 people. We saved 15,000 euros in a relatively expensive country, but we also were away from our daily responsibilities and were the most incredibly productive, like laser focused. And there's similar initiatives, co-working spaces in Southeast Asia. Now in Sweden, there's also the Spelkollektivitet, which charges you 215 euros a month for accommodation, food, and they even have a lot of hardware. So, but that's going the other side, right?
Yep.
Like that's not funding, that's saving money.
Yeah,
but it comes down
yeah.
to the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So, does that answer your question a bit? Cool. Anybody else? No questions?
I have one.
Oh,
so
there you go.
said that like investors invest in teams. What are they looking for? How should we build the teams that we want to sell the investors on?
Maarten, what are your experiences?
I mean, if an investor or a publisher, I mean, let's put that in the middle. If someone is looking at the company, it's indeed always about the team. It's like, what has this team delivered together? Normally you see, like with new startups, you see a great like PowerPoint where you see all these AAA games that all the people worked on, right? But then you ask yourself, oh, you were like a level designer on Doom. Okay, but what did you actually do, right? So normally they see through that. So it's really like, what is the team able to deliver together? What have they done before? And what is the team passionate about? Like sometimes I've seen that a team that, for example, is not passionate at all about, let's say, snowboarding games. They're pitching a snowboarding game, and then the investor is like, yeah, but why do you want to do a snowboarding game? Yeah, because we just feel like it and there's a gap in the market. Wrong. That team needs to be super passionate about this specific genre, right? So as a summary, it's experience, it's passion, it's obviously the setup of the team. How many programmers do you have? How many artists do you have? Do you have a designer? Do you have a producer? Very important. A lot of smaller companies don't have a producer, which I think is crucial to get your game across the finish line and to work with external people.
Yeah, saying your game designer is the producer is not usually the right answer.
And obviously, if you're pitching a free-to-play game, then obviously you need to have the right business people, business intelligence people, BI people that are able to review metrics and do things. But in general, again, it's all about how is this team able to deliver that game on that specific moment based on these features and those production values.
And like I said, the earlier the stage, right, the less you have to show. So the more important those exact points become, right? Because we'll just believe in you. We're pretty much investing in you to create whatever follows.
Okay, and so you said they look for like cumulative experience, but does that mean that the team has to have a release title already, or something that's completely...
Well, ideally, yes. And let's face it, we all know here in this room that a lot of developers that go out, they're pitching their first game, right? And it's always difficult, and that's the whole thing. I mean, eventually you need to mature as a company, and it comes down to, hey, you need to invest yourself. You need to sometimes release something yourself to make a name as a company, right? And then the next deal will be much easier. If you don't have a lot of experience, just try to show off what you're capable of. And again, finding the fun. Where is the fun in your game? If you show a fantastic gameplay mechanic that everyone loves, and you show a plan that supports that, even though the plan should include things like weaknesses of the team. What I normally really like with developers is that they present a risk analysis to a publisher and saying, well, actually, we know this game genre. We're trying to reinvent this game genre. We're going to add these new features. However, we've never done multiplayer, or we've never developed with Unreal. Having that risk analysis in your deck shows, even though you think it shows a weakness, it actually shows your strength. Because then you can go to a publisher and say, well, this is our approach, this is how we want to do it, but these are the potential risks. And everyone likes that, because then you're honest and very transparent. And that, I think, is a really interesting thing to incorporate in your materials. Always be humble, transparent, and open. Very important.
Yeah. Any other questions? So I see one over there. Cool.
Thanks. Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you briefly mentioned before that when you do an agreement with an investor, sometimes there are clauses that are there to test you, right? Can you give me some examples of that? Maybe it's useful for us to know how to spot them.
Oh, so that's a whole different topic altogether. But what you can expect is that, here's the deal. The contract, they're not going to make a special contract for every developer that they meet, right? So they'll have a standard contract in place, and Johnny, who just started making his game and is at a prototype phase and might have not put any money in there, is going to get the exact same contract as Maarten's client, who might have already put 200,000 euros into it, and God knows what. And so what do you get then, Maarten?
Yeah, but what do you mean with testing? You said testing.
I mentioned that. So I said like it's kind of a test, but that's a metaphor. So it's like you get the same contract whether you have something developed or not, and then you have to go back to the publisher and say the standard contract is fine, but
let me rephrase that a little bit.
Please
the one thing I think you need to be careful with, if we're talking about a publisher or investor testing you, normally they try to put in clauses that they, for example, say, well, if you, developer, don't deliver this game on March 1st, 2019, then you don't get any royalties anymore. Then you're going to waive your royalties. That's one, for example. I also saw an instance where the publisher is saying, well, if you're not going to successfully make these milestones, we're going to deduct 35% of that milestone. We're going to hold that until you've delivered that, and then you get the remaining 35%. So normally they try to build in certain mechanics to have leverage on you. And you need to be very careful with that, because I feel if you as a developer is delivering a milestone successfully and they approve it, then one, you obviously should get paid. But in general, in 8 of 10 cases, you're normally developing an IP that is owned by a publisher. Because if you're asking for 100% of funding from a publisher, normally they require the IP ownership, which then basically means you're doing work for hire. And I always say to a publisher, like, if my developer is doing a work for hire deal for you, they should always get paid. Because why should this company take a risk or put their own money into the game or advance the money to keep working on the game while it's your IP? That doesn't make sense. So be very careful at that as well. Because I personally feel that a developer shouldn't be like in lockdown or in a holding position to please get paid even though they delivered work, right? I know it's a little bit of a thing that everyone wants to improve. It still happens. But again, it comes down to making sure you have your ducks in a row, making sure you know what you want to build and have something tangible. Show a first playable, which gives you leverage on the publisher again.
And of course, there's a reason we have a job, and there's also a reason why lawyers have a job in this case, to look at those contracts with you, right?
Exactly.
So, any other questions? One right here in front.
And there in the back as well, but yeah, let's...
Oh, where was in the back? Can you show your hands real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go over there first. That's fine. And work our way back. In the meantime, while he's walking, I have a little game I want to play with you guys about the question about the friends, family, and stuff. Imagine you have 100,000 euros in your pocket right now, and you can only spend it on investing in other game companies. Think of someone in your circles that might have been raising, or think of that guy. Maybe he has an amazing game. Think about whether you want to invest in that or not. And then in 5 years from now, if you ever meet Maarten and me, come back to us and let's discuss if we should have done it or not.
Yep.
Right? Because I have a lot of game companies right now in my head. Maarten, I'm sure you do too,
course.
where we would have gladly shelled our personal money had we had it at that point in time, had we been able to invest in them as angels. In
Exactly.
This case. So
let's do the final two questions and then wrap up.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, in what stage should be my project, my game, before I would go to some investors and try to pitch my idea?
Yeah, I would say like first playable stage, so after pre-production. Again, because I think during pre-production you're going to really flesh out what the game will be. And of course you will have a lot of interesting materials like concept art and early designs and whatnot. But first playable, ideally. And yes, I know certain developers are going out with a gray box prototype. But if the gameplay mechanic, as I mentioned, is not really fun, then don't bother. Just spend more time and then go out when you have first playable.
Thank you.
And then the question in the front.
Yep.
There we go.
And also important, sometimes publishers very early on ask for a game design document. I would never provide that right away because it opens up a lot of questions and basically opens up a can of worms. Just make an extract of your game design document and provide that. Once they want to do a deal, then you should provide a game design document because normally that's a official deliverable in your contract.
So I'm interested in, given the situation that you could, as an indie developer, be able to afford to work on your game without publisher, what's your opinion about that? Can you like compare it, or are there any advantages or disadvantages of not going with publisher as indie developer? Would you recommend it at all? Thank you.
Well, I personally I would recommend it. Why? Because I think in general, if you look at a development studio, you want to concentrate on the game. And publishing a game is hard. I have a really good example. There's one of my clients is Rockfish Games in Hamburg, Germany, and they did Everspace. And we initially pitched the game. It's like a space shooter. We pitched it to all the publishers in the industry, and no one wanted to take it because, oh no, they're Star Citizen. Oh no, we don't want to do a space. They did a Kickstarter campaign, and it blew up, very successful. And the amount of work that Michael Schade, the owner of the studio, needed to do during the night, like answer questions for the community, work with PR and marketing agencies, again, talk to the community, work with the development team on creating assets. That's massive amounts of work. Normally, and especially the indie publishers are able to take away all of that burden that you have. They have the knowledge, they have the capacity, but more importantly, they have the network to talk to the best PR agency, to make sure that press is covering your game. That's very important. I would never undervalue that because I think a lot of people feel like, oh, publishers are not doing shit. No, they actually know their stuff, and it's very hard to learn that as a developer. We do see that more developers are learning it, but it's a steep learning curve. So the key is here, like outsourcing what you then don't need to do, and then you can focus on the game.
Yeah, look at PUBG Corp, right? Would there be PUBG Mobile without Tencent? I don't think so, right?
Nope.
So there's new people coming in, which also means that there's a new talk starting.
Yep.
Maarten, I'd like to personally thank you for being here in Prague with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. I also still quickly want to thank our government of the Netherlands. Maarten is from the Netherlands, I'm from the Netherlands, and they graciously, the embassy of the Netherlands here, made sure that Maarten was able to come here. So thanks for that, Dutch Embassy in Prague. And that's also why the banner is up here, just so you know. So thank you so much,
Thank you
guys.
very much.